My name is Steve Peace. I'm with the Florida Cancer Data System. I have been a registrar for over 30 years and have been teaching cancer registrars since about the second year that I became a registrar myself. So it's exciting to be here and be part of this Fundamentals of Abstracting workshop. This is a rather long session. It's kind of complex because we're dealing with a lot of big words. That's the scariest part, probably. It scares a lot of people, even seasoned registrars. They sometimes will shy away from lymphomas and certain types of leukemias because they kind of, the words freak them out too. And the nomenclature and the terminology keeps changing for these tumors. So that's one of the things that we'll talk about. This presentation was developed, Carol Johnson, who was the primary developer of the Hematopoietic and Lymphoid rules and database. She did this presentation last year, and I looped her presentation in with a couple of presentations that I have done in the past. And I worked with Carol on the rules and on the database, so I'm very familiar with what we're talking about today. We're going to talk about the hematopoietic and lymphoid neoplasms. I'm going to give you some background, going in and out of different things. We're going to kind of go simple stuff, technical stuff, internet, technical stuff, simple stuff. We're going to mix it up so I don't watch all of your eyes just glaze over. Okay, here's our outline. We want to talk about why these cases are so challenging. So that's primarily to let you know that you are not going to be alone in trying to figure these out. People have trouble with them. We're going to talk about the anatomy of the circulatory systems. There are two circulatory systems, not one. And a lot of registrars, even seasoned ones, don't really recognize that. So you have a blood circulatory system and a lymphatic circulatory system, and both of them function together. We're going to talk about some technical stuff in terms of hematopoiesis. First big word, everybody. Hematopoiesis is the process of creating in the bone marrow blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, what have you. And we're going to talk about cell line derivation. Then we will spend some time talking about the disease process and what's the process of the clinical workup. Because for a lot of these cases, the first signs and symptoms that a patient comes in, they have bruising or they have a swollen lymph node or something like that, and they can be kind of vague. So the clinical workup frequently will have a series of diagnoses leading up to the final diagnosis. So you can get a lot of provisional diagnoses where they're trying to rule in or rule out a certain type of malignancy. And then we'll talk about the process of confirming a diagnosis, including diagnostic confirmation. There's special diagnostic confirmation code for hematopoietic and lymphoid neoplasms. I'll tell you how to use that. And talk about disease progression and transformation. Some of the myeloid neoplasms have a tendency to go from a chronic form to an acute form. The chronic form can lay indolent and not really do a whole lot, and they might not even be treated, but it may transform into an acute phase of that disease, and that'll then be a new primary, and they need attention right away, and they get chemo right away. So we'll talk about that more. What I really want to spend most of the time on is tools and rules. And all the stuff that I'm going to be talking about is captured in the hematopoietic database and the hematopoietic and lymphoid neoplasm rules. But I want you to know how to find it, where it is, how to use it. For a lot of the technical stuff that I'm going to be teaching, it's really background. But so you can understand how to use the database and what to look for a little bit better. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on just the myeloid neoplasms and then just the lymphoid neoplasms. We're talking about two separate groups. And then we'll talk about staging at the end. So why are these cases so challenging? And how do you get through all this maze of stuff? Well, the terminology can be very confusing and complicated, especially when you're looking at multiple terms that get used in the same disease process. Is it one primary? Is it two primaries? What kind of leukemia is it? What kind of lymphoma is it? That kind of stuff. And pathologists, especially pathologists that have been around for a while, might use multiple terminology, older terminology and newer terminology in the same path report, or in the same special studies or something like that. So you need to kind of be familiar with the past, the present, and the future when you're looking at these diseases. Fortunately, most of these conditions include the words leukemia or lymphoma in them, but not all of them. Some don't even sound like leukemia or lymphoma. Would you typically think of reporting a myeloid sarcoma? Probably, but as a sarcoma, right? Myeloid sarcoma is actually a manifestation of a myeloid leukemia. And myeloid sarcoma used to be called chloroma. And back in the day, before we had all the studies that we have now, they would open these patients up during surgery and expose that solid myeloid mass of tissue, and it would turn green because of the air. So it would contact with the air and turn green. So they called them chloromas. They thought there was chlorophyll or something like that with them. And now they're called myeloid sarcomas. Things have changed. Multiple myeloma, people are pretty familiar with that. But then we start to get into things like refractory anemia and polycythemia vera and things that don't sound like they're malignant. They sound like, and for many cases, they used to be considered and treated as pre-malignant conditions. So over time, the research has shown that they're early stages of disease. So they might be more chronic stages, and then they might become acute at a later time. Primary myelofibrosis, myelodysplastic syndrome, and post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder. Notice that most of these have myeloid or myelo in them. That's a good clue, because most of the lymphomas have the word lymphoma in it, or lymphoid. Another reason that they're tough is for kids, you'll see certain types of leukemias and lymphomas. Most of the leukemias that you see will be acute lymphocytic or lymphoblastic leukemia or pre-B cell. And the lymphomas, they can vary, but see, there's a pretty small percentage for the young kids. But for the teenagers, they go up quite a bit. Leukemias start to go down. But lymphomas and leukemias make up a large percentage of pediatric tumors. Leukemias, 44.2 cases per million, which is that's the highest number of incidents for the kids, brain and CNS tumors, and then lymphomas. So 2 out of the top 3 is what we're looking at for kids. For adults, it's a whole different picture. We got leukemias way down here, 3%. We have non-Hodgkin's lymphomas at 4%. So we have a much smaller percentage. You have a different kind of neoplasm, and you see a lot fewer of them in adults as a makeup of the totality of the cases that you report and see. Do we have anybody from the pediatric registry? You see pediatric kids. You see kids. Oh, okay. Okay. Now, these percentages, while they're low, they can represent a lot of cases. So, because we have a lot, we have a lot of adults. The kids are just under the age of 19. So that's another reason that they're difficult to use. You don't see them real frequently, and you see different ones in kids and adults. So let's do a little bit of anatomy. Everybody's pretty familiar with the blood circulatory system, right? You have a heart and arteries and veins, and they all pump blood, they go to the lungs and get air and all that kind of stuff. But we also have a lymphatic circulatory system. And the lymphatic circulatory system parallels a lot of the blood circulatory system. And we'll talk about the reasons for that as we move through. But the circulatory system in the blood, while it will intermix the lymph in the blood never mixes with the lymphatic system. So it's a one-way street there. And then as the lymphatics go through the body and they're performing an immune function, They go out in the body and they look for foreign bodies and, you know, whatever they might be doing, viruses or bacteria. And so they need to be distributed quickly to lots of parts of the body. They use the blood circulatory system as a highway to get around. They also use the blood circulatory system to recollect, and then they start circulating back through the lymphatic capillaries into lymphatic channels, lymph nodes, and then these different large ducts. The thoracic duct is very important. Cisterna chyli is very important. You won't really see a lot of those things, but understanding that this process occurs is an important part of understanding the lymphomas. It also helps you understand the staging a little bit more, because when you look at the blood circulatory system, it doesn't have these little collection sites like lymph nodes or the spleen or the thymus. It just circulates and gives nutrients to the body and then cleans out stuff. But the lymphatic circulatory system tends to cluster into lymph nodes and lymphatic organs, and because things cluster like that, lymphomas can kind of look like more solid masses at times. And for staging, they're staged a little bit more similarly to solid tumors than the leukemias. So we have a lot of lymphatic organs, things that you might not recognize. So we'll talk about the lymphatic circulatory system a little bit more. This is a gigantic lymph node. And some anatomy of this, what's this part called? You have one in your kidney, you have one in your lung. Anything that looks like this kidney bean shape has a hilus. And that's that little central portion there. And that's where things go in and out of the lymph node. So when you see the term hilus, you need to know what organ they're talking about. It could be the hilus of the lung, it could be the hilus of the kidney, or it could be something as small as a hilus in a lymph node. So the lymph nodes act as filters, much like many of the other lymphatic organs. We'll talk about the spleen a little bit. In the spleen, I don't know all this stuff by hand, off the top of my head, by the way. So for the spleen, we're really looking at a blood filter. And the spleen is divided into two different parts, really, a red pulp and a white pulp. And the red pulp deals with the myeloid stuff, or the red blood cells, and the white pulp deals with the lymphocytes, or the white blood cells. So they stay pretty separate. There is a marginal zone in the red pulp, and that's where the marginal zone lymphomas come from. Other things about the spleen that are really important are, while the bone marrow, and I'm going to read some of this. While the bone marrow is the primary site of hematopoiesis in the adult, the spleen has important functions up until the 5th month of gestation. And as a major lymphoid organ, the spleen retains the ability to produce lymphocytes and remains hematopoietic origin. So the bone marrow, we'll talk about hematopoiesis in just a couple minutes. The bone marrow produces the red blood cells and the white blood cells and platelets. Platelets turn out to be white blood cells eventually, is what we've learned. The spleen can also store the red blood cells, the lymphocytes, and other parts of the blood. And one of the most interesting things is up to a quarter of the lymphocytes in the entire body can be stored in the spleen at one time. And when the lymphocytes are forming, they start out forming in the bone marrow, and then they migrate to the thymus where they mature. And this is all during the very early parts of gestation and just after birth. About 94%, 95% of the lymphocytes die in the first couple of years after you're born, because they don't have anything to react to, so they don't stick around. So here we're going to talk about hematopoiesis, the beginning. This is a wonderful painting by a physician from Kaiser Permanente, from the Kaiser Permanente Journal from 2007. This is their interpretation of hematopoiesis and bringing life into the body which I always thought was pretty cool. So a hematopoietic stem cell is called a polypurulent or something like that, which means that a hematopoietic stem cell can become any kind of blood or lymphatic cell that it wants to be. And at some point in time, something signals that cell to become a B lymphocyte or a T lymphocyte or a red blood cell or something else. So these hematopoietic stem cells are found in the bone marrow, and they give rise to all the blood cells and all the blood cell lines. And we're going to talk about two primary lines, and you'll hear me repeat this over and over. Lymphoid, myeloid. The myeloids are most of the leukemias and the pre-leukemias, and the lymphoids are most of the lymphomas. Some of the lymphomas are diagnosed at a late stage, and they are in a leukemic phase because they're circulating wildly throughout the blood and reproducing. So that's where you get the lymphoid leukemia. The reason that we talk about cell line differentiation and cell line proliferation is this process of regulating what type of cell your body needs and how many of them is really important. It's important to the immune function, it's important to the circulatory function, and when you start talking about the plasma cells, it's important to blood clotting and things like that. If you overproduce or underproduce, that's the proliferation. Proliferation sounds like overproduction, and most of the time it is, but when you overproduce one kind of cell, it crowds out the other cells. And here's a nice picture of a leg bone, and you can see the hematopoiesis process. This is an older slide. Platelets are still being classified, and this is not that old of a slide, as a separate group. And in the latest classification in 2008, which is what the hematopoietic database and the rules are based on, so all this stuff that we're going to talk about this morning, the platelets go up into the white blood cell group because they turn out that they're B lymphocytes. Sure, we'll talk about it more later. I'll repeat several of these things, and I'll say it different ways. So repetition is good. You will never remember everything I say today, so don't try. Just try and listen and absorb most of what I'm talking about. That's why I want to give you foundation, show you the database, and then go back to foundation and the database, because they go hand in hand. Here's a nice definition for cell line differentiation. It's the process by which an immature cell becomes a more mature cell. Let that sink in a minute. So these undeveloped stem cells eventually, so they're immature cells, eventually become more and more mature. And I'll show you a graphic in just a sec of the different stages of maturity. When you look at whether or not a tumor, like a solid tumor, is moderately differentiated or poorly differentiated, that's kind of the reverse. That's when the cells start to de-differentiate, and they start to become more malignant, and they start to look less like mature cells and more like immature cells or bizarre cells. So there's a back and forth there too. When cells differentiate, and this is not just hematopoietic cells, the cells change size, they change function, they change shape, the cell surfaces can change. So the characteristics really become more specific and very specific to certain types of cells. Spleen cells are going to be different than lung cells, for example. And this whole process of regulating proliferation and cell line differentiation is to keep the body in balance. Anytime you have over or under production, you have a malignant process starting. And it could be early in the process or it could be later in the process, and it can change in the middle. So, good. That's how these are so complex and confuse people so much. So, most of the time when you see over or underproduction or proliferation, it's one cell line. So it's one type of red blood cell, or one type of B cell, or one type of T cell. And that's called a clonal proliferation. And that's how they're identified, and that's how they're classified. And too many or too few cells can lead to either a chronic or an acute condition. What we've learned over the years, many of the things that we used to call syndromes, bone marrow syndromes, are actually early leukemic processes. So that's why a lot of these terms that don't sound like leukemia are like leukemias, but they're just not called that early on. And it's interesting in terms of research that not all the research on these tumors is done at NCI, the National Cancer Institute. And the reason for that is there's another institute called the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And the Blood Institute has a lot of research on what used to be pre-malignant conditions, all the myelodysplastic syndromes, polycythemia vera. That research all started in a different institute at the National Institutes of Health before they knew that they were actually leukemias already. So now the NHLBI and the NCI work together for a lot of these cancers. This is a more current description from 2008. And we're going to talk about just above the red line. Just above the red line are the lymphomas. So here is the omnipotent hematopoietic stem cell. And here, these either become myeloid or lymphoid at the first step of differentiation. And then when we look at just the lymphoids, we see pre-T cell and pre-B cell. So they're making up their mind that they're going to become a T cell or a B cell. This is a really sensitive stage for a leukemia development because these cells are changing rapidly. They're maturing. And because all of this function is changing, they have a tendency to go a little crazy. And something turns on and doesn't turn off, or something turns off and never turns back on in terms of the regulation of how many cells to produce or how much to differentiate and become a real T or B lymphocyte. So here's when they commit. And then these are different stages of maturity, not really well defined yet. So it's possible that in the future, these different areas are going to lead to some new types of diagnoses of lymphomas. We might be able to find out that here's where the genetic mutations occur, or maybe all of them occur here, but we don't see them until they differentiate into full T or B cells. There's still a lot of unknown. And it's interesting because leukemias were really the first project of the NCI. Childhood leukemias were something that were highly sensitive, highly emotional, and they got a lot of attention in the 50s and the 40s, and they were the first malignancies that they started testing nitrogen mustard on and stuff like that. So chemotherapy started because of testing of leukemias. We're not going to talk about the lower part yet. We're still on the lymphoids, okay? So for B cell line differentiation, don't let the complexity of this knock you out, okay? It's actually very simple. This is a bone, this is bone marrow. It becomes an immature cell and later a mature cell. And it could be a marginal zone. That's all that shows to people like me. This diagram came out of the WHO classification of neoplasms of hematopoietic and lymphoid origin, which is what is the basis for the hematopoietic database. And those WHO books, they're also called the Berg Blue Books or the Blue Books. They've been around for a long time. John Berg was the originator, Dr. John Berg of the Blue Books. You know this. He happened to be a friend of mine and a mentor early in my career, and he was late in his career, and really interesting man, wonderful man. And the Berg Blue Books started out as little pamphlets for about 7 tumors. 7 primary sites. And they have matured with the World Health Organization over time. And right now, the hematopoietic and lymphoid neoplasms, the blue book is a regular sized book. It's about 400 pages. It's written for pathologists, not for registrars. Don't go out and buy it. It's a couple $100 because what we've done when we developed the hematopoietic rules in the database, Carol and I read that book cover to cover. Carol probably read it 7 or 8 times. I read it 3. And that was really want to go to sleep? Just a little excerpt. But these malignancies have always been really fascinating to me. As an early registrar, I was terrified of them. When my mentor, one of my in the office mentors, every time I got a lymphoma or leukemia, I handed it to Debbie. It's like, okay, I'll do the prostates, I'll do the lungs, I'll do the colons, I'll do the breast. Lymphoma, no. Because I was afraid of them. The words scared me. I didn't understand them. And eventually how I conquered that was by learning a lot about them. That's the reason that I know a lot about them, is because they used to really confuse me a lot. So that was the B cells. Most of the lymphomas are of B cell origin, and most of them are of mature B cell origin, not pre-B. Kids get pre-B cell leukemias and lymphomas. Adults usually get mature B cell lymphomas. The T cell lymphomas, or the T cell derivation, is not only in the bone marrow, but remember we talked about the thymus where they matured. So they migrate out of the bone marrow into the thymus where they mature. It's like a little nesting area. And in the first couple of years of after birth, the thymus starts to shrink. And by the time you're an adult, your thymus is kind of gone. You do not produce any new T cells once you're born. You do produce B cells forever. The B cells are the memory cells, the ones that remember what types of viruses you were exposed to, what kind of bacteria you were exposed to, and they're the ones that will go and attack those intruders. The T cells are the helper cells that tell the B cells what to do. Okay? That's the simplest way to describe it. Any questions about that first part? Time to take a little breath. Now we're going to talk about the myeloid line. Now look at all those different types of red blood cells. So here we have a stem cell, and they have to decide to commit to any number of these types of red blood cells. Erythrocytes, regular red blood cell that we know of, megakaryocytes or platelets, basophils or mast cells. Some of these might sound mast cell neoplasms, eosinophils, neutrophils, macrophages, and osteoclasts. Do you have to remember that? No. But you do need to be familiar with this part and the fact that those differentiate into lots of different types of red blood cells. The reason we have so many types of myeloid leukemias and other syndromes and things like that, like polycythemia vera and myeloid metaplasia, other things that don't sound like cancer, is because of all these different types of cells they can become. And at any point in time in that maturation or differentiation process, malignancy can begin. I go pretty quickly through the myeloid part. The regulatory function of the cells is really where the magic is with these kind of cancers. And by the way, this is just another picture of the hematopoiesis process, except instead of going this way, it's going this way. These are the lymphoids. These are the myeloids. You don't see very many natural killer cells, so I don't really talk about them very much. And this one is a more current one. And you see the plasma cells? They're under the B lymphocytes now. So this is in a matter of 5 years, this all started to change. What turns on or turns off this proliferation or differentiation? There are proteins and other things inside the nucleus on the cell surface in different places that are growth factors and proteins that may be in the cell or around the cell. But where we really start to look at the issues of where we have problems are in the genes. The problems seem to stem, we're finding out, or maybe because we're looking at all the genes now, that they're genetic mutations. So when you see some of those terms that have T:6 slash, all this alphabet soup, that's telling you what the genetic mutation is. It's a translocation of gene 6 on chromosome 14, and it translocates with another chromosome and that kind of stuff. So you will never be able to memorize those, ever. I don't think, unless you just really have it. And a lot of them are really new. So that's why we have a lot of new histologies for the hematopoietics. ICD-03, don't use it for these tumors, period. Now, what I do with my staff, if they're new and I'm teaching this to them, I have them take out their ICD-03s, and anything with the code 9590 or greater, you don't use ICD-04. So a lot of this is becoming familiar with the terminology. Let's look at some of the basic terminology now. Leuc equals white, and emia equals blood. Have we already lost her? It's like that's an early fallout. So when you think of leukemia, most people don't think of white blood cells, do they? Most people think of anemias and red blood cells, right? So why is leukemia about white blood cells? Think about proliferation. If you have red blood cells proliferating, they start crowding out the white blood cells. So the white blood cells become scarce, or they can't function well, or the red blood cells, forgot what I was going to say, can begin to blast. So they can really transform and become very blastic. And what happens when those become blastic is they don't die. They keep growing. Your red blood cells don't have a very long life. They keep reproducing in your bone marrow, and you keep, because they have a hard life. They've got to nourish your body. Your stomach doesn't. Your stomach starts the process, but getting it to all the parts of your body is your circulatory system. So when the bone marrow starts to produce excess white blood cells or excess red blood cells, you can have any of these conditions. More terminology, and this is just what I was talking about, the opposite, where the white blood cells crowd out the red blood cells. So it can be either one. When you have a low red blood cell count, you're anemic. Everybody pretty much knows that, right? Low platelets mean that you have a tendency to possibly bleed and not be able to clot. So platelets are a very important part of the blood as well. Before I talk about this, I want to talk about two things that people get confused with that have to do with the blood as well. The difference between plasma, or blood plasma, and a plasma cell. A plasma cell is a certain type of B lymphocyte. It's a certain type of cell. But blood plasma has lots of blood components in it. It doesn't just have B cells. It can have red blood cells, white blood cells, natural killer cells, and a lot of other fluids in it. So understanding the difference between those two can be confusing to a lot of folks just because of the terminology. Plasma cells, also called plasma B cells, are white blood cells which secrete large volumes of antibodies. Remember, the B cells and the T cells are part of the immune system, so this is the antibodies and the immune function. They are transported by the blood plasma and the lymphatic system, and they ultimately originate in the bone marrow. They leave the bone marrow as B cells, And they eventually differentiate into plasma cells, and they usually differentiate in the lymph nodes themselves. So those plasma cells are maturing in the lymph nodes. The T cells are maturing in the thymus. The B cells are maturing in the bone marrow and the spleen. The plasma is a liquid component of the blood that holds all the different types of blood cells in a suspension. It makes up about 55% of the total blood volume, and it has proteins and hormones and clotting factors and electrolytes. So it has a bunch of stuff in there. It's not just a type of cell. When we talk about leukemias, the fact that we're having a proliferation of white blood cells and they're not working correctly, they don't have a chance to mature, so they can perform their immune function correctly. Patients with early leukemias frequently get lots of infections because their immune system isn't working. People think of leukemia as a blood disorder, but it's a blood lymphatic disorder. You know, they both work together. Low platelets cause bruising and purple spots, and low red blood cells, because of too many white blood cells, can cause weakness and fatigue. So these are all common symptoms of early leukemias. And this is a nice picture of that with lots of different types of symptoms. Some of them are vague, but when you start to see these in combination, you start to put together the picture. And when we talk about the process of reaching and determining the actual diagnosis, some of these symptoms actually play a part in that, and they also play a part in staging. Chronic leukemias, there are different types. Chronic myelogenous leukemia, chronic myeloid leukemia. They sound very similar. They are not the same. And chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Now, CLL is common in older adults. Very common. It's very, for most patients, has very low malignant potential. Doesn't really affect people that much, except it makes them tired, it makes them fatigued. They might have some other symptoms, and it can become acute. Not very often, though. The chronic myeloid leukemias, however, have a tendency to, in greater than 10% of the cases, become acute. Most people think of chronic diseases as diseases of older people, right? Kids can have chronic myeloid leukemias too, and they frequently will become acute. Okay, so they frequently transform. And when they transform like that, you actually do two abstracts. You do one for the chronic and one for the acute. They have completely different disease courses and different treatments, so they're now treated as two different types of cancers. Okay, and that'll get repeated. So most of these chronic leukemias have a fairly long chronic phase. They can be present for a long time. And usually they're followed by blood smears, and they just keep an eye on it to see if it's changing. This accelerated phase, it's rare. Yeah, I guess I'll say rare. It's rare to see a chronic becoming acute. To catch it in that accelerated phase is usually just the luck of the draw. Okay, because somebody is astute enough, aware enough of their body that they see their symptoms changing, and they go to the doctor, and they might find it in an accelerated phase. But most of the time, you see it jump from chronic to acute or blastic. Acute leukemias, on the other hand, once they become acute, it's very sudden, it's very rapidly progressive, and when they become blastic, they tear through your body. This is why in the 50s, 90% of kids with acute lymphoblastic leukemia died. Today, 98% of them live a fairly good life. So there's been a lot of research over time, but once something goes into a blastic phase or an acute phase, those people require chemotherapy usually within a few days of their diagnosis, or they'll die. And those kids or adults are quite sick. Acute leukemias are more common in kids than in adults. Now, lymphomas happen to be diseases of lymphocytes where we have uncontrolled growth of the lymphocytes, the white blood cells. And with that, they can start to clog lymph nodes when they start to recirculate back in. They can form and collect into solid masses in organs because your lymphatics, the B cells and the T cells and natural killer cells are everywhere in your body, just like your blood. You know, we're familiar with the veins and the capillaries and the arteries and things, the major structures, because we can see them. But we don't see all the smaller structures where they go in and out of cells and clean them up and feed them and all those kind of things. Same thing with the lymphocytes. So lymphocytes tend to cluster because of the filtration process that the lymphatic system performs. As the lymphocytes get filtered in the lymph nodes or in the spleen or in tonsils or other organs, they can form what appear to be kind of solid masses. So they are more like a solid tumor than a liquid tumor. Another slang term for leukemias and lymphomas are liquid tumors. Lymphomas rarely involve the bone marrow early. Late in the disease process, a lymphoma can involve the bone marrow. Or if it's a lymphoblastic leukemia, which is a leukemia that involves the lymphatics, that starts out in the bone marrow. This is what I mean. You'll never remember everything that I'm talking about, so just kind of absorb as we go along. We have lots of different types of lymphomas. This is the current, oh no it isn't. There are Hodgkin lymphomas, mature B-cell lymphomas, mature T-cell lymphomas, natural killer cell lymphomas. You don't see those I've seen very few of those actually in my 30 plus years. Histiocytic and dendritic cell lymphomas, which the current thinking for histiocytic and dendritic cell lymphomas is that eventually we'll go into the B-cell group. They just haven't found the right indicator to slot them in there, just like the plasma cells. And the precursor lymphoid neoplasms, which are neoplasms of the precursor cells before they commit to becoming a B or a T cell. And a new classification group are the post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorders. People who get transplants, kidney, lung, whatever, they have to get immune suppressant drugs so their bodies don't reject those organs. Those immune suppressants make them susceptible to developing lymphomas. And those are called post-transplant lymphoproliferative or lymphomas. And they're fairly common in post-transplant adults. But the transplant people know that, so they keep an eye out on it. What I'd like you to do now is pull out your computers, and if you didn't bring a computer, find a partner that you can look over, because this is showing you how to start using the tools. Okay? And go ahead and get those signed on. I'm not going to display exactly what you're looking at yet. Okay? Eventually, I will switch over to the internet also, but you won't be able to see it very well on the screen. I'll give you a couple minutes to get on. And when you do get on, go to seer.cancer.gov, G-O-V. If you use this computer for home or for work, or both, or if you just want to bookmark this page, this is a page you should have bookmarked, okay? Either that or you can type it really fast. Like I can type seer.cancer.gov really fast if I can't find my links. And when you get to seer.cancer.gov, maybe I should do this. Okay, let me do this. Is that what y'all are seeing? Okay, and by the nods, I know you're on. Do bookmark this page either in your office or on your and go to Information for Cancer Registrars. I'm not going to go through this whole page, but there's a whole bunch of stuff on here about SEER. But you know, this is what we're mostly interested in, is the Information for Cancer Registrars. So go ahead and click there. And there's a bunch of stuff here too. There are case finding lists here in ICD-9 CM and ICD-10 CM. Coding and staging manuals, collaborative stage links, and training, hematopoietic project. Whoa, that's probably what we're going to be looking at, isn't it? Historical manuals, ICD-03 coding materials, multiple primary histology coding rules, and the summary staging manual 2000. So, and then if you have questions for SEER, here's where you ask a SEER registrar, and the SEER inquiry system is basically the same thing. This is the older version. So we're going to go to, so this is where you find your MPH rules for solid tumors. This is where you find the hematopoietic database, the live version or the one you can download to your desktop. This is also where you find SEER-RX, which is the SEER drug database. Okay, we're not going to go through all that stuff, but just to give you a little orientation, navigation to this site. It's one of the things that we're trying to improve with people is not just telling them to go there and find it, but I try and teach people and show people where to look so it looks familiar, so they have that visual memory, and they'll remember it better. So under the Hematopoietic project, I clicked that little plus sign, and it expanded this. So we have several things here. We have the Hematopoietic and Lymphoid database, and there is an online version, and there's a version you can download to your desktop. And I'll talk about the pros and cons for each. There's a revision history that tells you what got changed in different versions, because you know nothing ever stays the same in our world. And online training. Online training started in 2010. We recorded a bunch of background material. We recorded webcasts on how to use the database, how to use the rules. So there's a lot of material here. They're getting ready to revise this for 2014, I think, and update it a little bit. Not huge revisions, but some. So here are all these online trainings. And if you want to watch one of them, you can download the slides, or you can watch the presentation. And of course, I clicked on this one because this is one of mine. Okay, it's going to be too slow. I just wanted to show you that it's a recorded webcast with PowerPoint slides and somebody walking you through it. So all the information is never in just the slides themselves. You know, a lot of the information that I'm going to be sharing with you is me kind of ad-libbing and seeing if people recognize what I'm talking about. And if you don't, if I see blank faces, I will try another hallway. So if you need a refresher after this course, you can go back to these and watch some of these too. I think it tells you how long they are. Yeah. Most of them are 20 minutes, or some of them are longer. It just depends on what they are. Okay? But that information is always there and available to you. So I'm going to go back up here to the database. Oh, just scroll back up. I'm going back up here to the database. This is the online version. And there's some really interesting things here. It kind of looks daunting just at the outset, doesn't it? This is a search feature, so you can type in words or parts of words, or you can even enter in like the translocation, the alphabet soup, and it'll find stuff. There's a multiple primaries calculator that once you use the printed rules, which are pretty simple for multiple primaries, you can also look at the multiple primaries calculator. And we're going to talk about this in steps, okay? There is also embedded in here a PDF. This is the coding manual that goes with the database. The database and the manual work together, just like they will with the new solid tumors. pretty soon the multiple primary and histology coding rules for all the other cancers are going to be in a database like this. So they'll be easier to use. So the first thing that we're going to look at here is the search feature, because that's the first place, the easiest place to start. So you don't want to type in leukemia or Luke, because you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff. Okay? And it highlights whatever you typed in there. You can type in a whole word, a part of a word, what have you. So I'm typing in poly because I want to look at polycythemia vera. Okay? And the reason I want to look at polycythemia vera is because that's our first exercise. Or is it? Pull out your exercises, if you would, and look at number 1. Case number 1 has a bone marrow biopsy that, okay, it's the end of the slides. And by the way, the answers are in there too. They're like, do you want them to have the answers too? And it's like, yeah. Okay. And you'll also see that we have 200 slides to get through in our 4 hours. So don't let that scare you either. Okay. Now, the bone marrow shows probable myeloproliferative neoplasm, polycythemia vera, essential thrombocythemia, or primary myelofibrosis. Okay, so the first one I looked at was polycythemia vera. Okay? Now, let's look up essential thrombocythemia. And I'm just going to type in essential. Hopefully I typed it right. Yeah. Okay, essential thrombocythemia is not the same as polycythemia vera. Okay, let's look at what else we got here. Primary myelofibrosis. Let's look up primary. Or I might have looked up myelofibrosis, might be better. But, because we have a bunch of different primaries. So let's back out of this and type in myelofibrosis. There we go. Okay. Uh-oh, we have a problem. Primary myelofibrosis is another kind of... So right now we have 3 different things that are on there. And we probably could look up myeloproliferative neoplasm too. Let's look up myeloproliferative. Let's see. Myeloproliferative... We have chronic myeloproliferative disease, but here, this is OBS. What does that mean? Obsolete. You know what that means to you? Don't use it. Don't use that code. C9975. So let's take a look at that. You don't have to type in words, but you have to be able to type, or see at least. Oh, I have a J in front of it, sorry. And it didn't find anything. How about that? Because there's a J. By the way, I have problems with my vision. I can't see out of my left eye at all. So I struggle sometimes with some of this stuff, and it's fairly new. Okay, 9975 is the new code, and it is not obsolete, but this is where it says this one is obsolete. See this other code. So most of the obsoletes will tell you to go to another code, and that's what you should look up. Okay. So these are the simplest parts of using this database. So we can look things up lots of different ways. So we can tell right away that here we have 4 different conditions, 4 different histology codes. Do we know what this is? No. So we can't solve this case yet. We don't know enough about this case or how to use the rules in the database. Eventually we'll get there. So when I display this first case, usually I put it on the screen and go, nope, we can't answer that, and zip right by it. So what I want to do now is show you a little bit more about what's in the database. There's a lot of stuff here. So you can do your searches. You have the manual that you need to use. Also, people forget the manuals are there. I think that they should be in big red letters or something like that. You can download that manual to your desktop, or you can download the database to your desktop. But what is the possible problem with that? Getting updates. Eventually, SEER plans to phase out the desktop versions. Even though folks use them when they're in the field, if they don't have internet access, and you do need to use this when you're working on these cases. This gives instant updates if it's live, and you don't have to worry about people using outdated versions. I actually have registrars, and I shouldn't tell this group this, but I have registrars in Florida who refuse to use the database. And now they're starting to get a lot of errors on the cases. They think it's, oh, I don't do well with that computer stuff. And with repeat reinforcement and showing them how to use it, they're all coming around. So here we have lots of different stuff. And different ways to sort our solutions here, but we're not talking about that. So we have disease information and the name. Now the name is the current preferred WHO, World Health Organization terminology for this condition. Okay, so your pathologist might not call it this. Your pathologist might call it one of these alternate names. Okay, and some of these alternate name lists are long. In addition to the name, we have the ICD-03 code. Some of the codes in the database are not in your ICDO book. That's why you should not use your ICDO book right now for these cancers. In 2014, we will be releasing an update to the ICD-03. We've been reviewing all the different WHO updates because they review these every 5 years on a rotating basis. Sometime, every 5 years they look at breast, every 5 years they look at lung, and they have it on a different sliding schedule. So currently, this is the nomenclature that they're supposed to be using in pathology. And the ICD-03 codes, whether they appear in ICDO or not. Those blue books that I talked about, that's where the ICDO codes come from. So there are provisional codes in those WHO books that are for the pathologist, but we don't end up getting those until sometimes a few years after. So we're trying to close that gap and make these more current. We don't know when ICD-04 will officially be produced. For several years we were told there would be no ICD-04, but I think the United States has, and other parts of other countries have made it enough of a point that we need an ICD-04. That we think it's going to be 2015. Not sure yet. So this also tells you, I guess I should stay here, whether or not this condition is reportable. In the 2014 version of this database, you will have more not reportable conditions than you currently have. So if you see terms that look like they might be something that you need to report, some of those iffy ones are going to be added, so people don't get confused and try and fit a round hole and a round peg in a square hole. It also tells you the primary site. This happens to be bone marrow, C421. There should be a decimal point right there. Connie Percy would scream that it wasn't there. But when you look at some of the lymphomas, there might not be a primary site because lymphomas can originate in lots of different places. But if there is a definite primary site that you're supposed to code this to, it will tell you that here. It'll also tell you what grade you need to code. Now the grade for all the myeloids is 9. The grade or differentiation or cell line for the lymphomas That's where you document if it's a B cell or a T cell or a natural killer cell. So, and if you don't get the right grade with the neoplasm, you'll get an error. You'll get an edit failure. If there is a specific rule in the manual that you need to use with this condition, it will tell you what rules you need to refer to in the printed or the PDF version. That means you really should go there and look at them. It'll tell you about primary sites. The module rule might tell you how to code the histologies, but it'll point you right to where you need to go in those rules. Alternate names we talked about. Oh, down here's a definition. Here's a definition for, what are we looking at here? Myeloid proliferative, myelodysplastic, unclassifiable. Abstractor notes. Now, the abstractor notes in the 2014 update will be reorganized and made a little bit more clear. Carol put most of the abstractor notes in herself. And basically what she did was she would read a chapter in the WHO book, in the technical book, try and translate it into cancer registrar lingo, and put it in the abstractor notes. So typing that in, this is the second version. So they've been reviewed and they're being updated, and they're being formatted in a more systematic way now. So sometimes it's hard to find things in the abstractor notes, but the abstractor notes are really important because they tell you about the condition, they tell you what tests to look for, they tell you about the disease process and what happens next. And then further down here, see, these are pretty extensive abstractor notes because this is a really nebulous and unclassifiable group. So there's a lot of explanation that says basically try and find a better diagnosis is what these notes basically say. Yeah, they're kind of lengthy that way. Carol can talk a lot too, just like me. Definitive diagnostic methods. This is really important for these conditions. And this is a simple one because it's just a bone marrow biopsy. Some of them are clinical, which means all they look at is a blood smear or a CBC, and they can't really figure out what else is going on, and they make a diagnosis. They don't do any genetic studies. They don't have any special stains. They don't have any tumor markers or anything like that. Or they've ruled out all these other diseases, so they say, okay, it's this. The genetics testing, the immunophenotyping, and the definitive diagnostic methods all go together. In your handouts at the end, you should also have a handout that looks like this without all the writing on it that says diagnostic confirmation codes. The diagnostic confirmation codes, you're accustomed to seeing and using probably positive histology most of the time, right? Because most tumors are biopsied and they're histologically proven. These neoplasms, a lot more is known about them with specific types of tests. So the immunophenotyping and the genetic tests can very directly identify what type of neoplasm it is and give you an exact histology. But when you look at code 3, which is new, positive histology plus positive immunophenotyping and or positive genetic studies, registrars don't always understand that it has to be this test confirms the diagnosis and it's positive, not this test was negative and says it's not this cancer. Does that make sense? So if the tests are negative, you don't use this code 3 just because they did the test. You use the code 3 when the test confirms that it's this type of cancer. Okay? So when you look at diagnostic confirmation for solid tumors, for lung or colon or whatever, that 3 isn't in there. It's only for these hematopoietic and lymphoids. And it's only to be used when a specific test identifies specifically a type of cancer. So there's no hierarchy here like there is for solid tumors. Solid tumors, a 1 takes priority, a 2 is next, But here, a 1 and a 3, really a 3 is actually better than a 1. So we're looking beyond just the microscope into the genetic structure. Okay? So it's really tightly defined. The database also tells you what treatments. So it tells you what drugs to look for. It tells you different things like that. Looks for blood thinners here. It also tells you whether or not this type of malignancy can transform to something else. So let's look at chronic. Okay, let's look at chronic myeloid leukemia. And here it is over here. Again, the name, ICD-03 code, it's reportable. This is a bone marrow too. You know, see, I'm sticking with the myeloids. Definition, some abstractor notes. Here, diagnostic methods, bone marrow biopsy, and or peripheral blood. So they can make a diagnosis of CML just by looking at the peripheral blood. So they can just take some blood out and look at it under the microscope. Or they could do a bone marrow biopsy. No genetic testing, no immunophenotyping. The immunophenotyping will just be for the lymphomas, by the way, because that's when you tell it's a B or a T. Treatments are listed here. So it will tell you in the treatments what to look for, and it will also tell you, in some cases, some specific drugs and things like that. Like when we talk about some of, like polycythemia vera, we're going to talk about TKIs and things like that. So, this one doesn't have a transformation. So chronic myeloid leukemia, NOS, doesn't transform. But if we look at chronic myelogenous leukemia, BCR-ABL1 positive, more alphabet soup, BCR-ABL1 is the Philadelphia chromosome translocation that is a confirming diagnosis for CML. In 98% of CML cases, they will have this BCR-ABL1 gene mutation. And this one won't transform according to this either. But there's a mistake there. That can transform. There's an obsolete one. I'm trying to get a transformation for you. Here we go. This is chronic myeloproliferative disease, even though it is obsolete. We'll go ahead and use it as an example. We could go to 9975, but for time, we'll just look at this. Look at all these transformations. Because this is such a non-specific condition, there is a tendency for it to become and what they call declare itself, and then they can have a different diagnosis. And these, when they declare themselves, that's when they need immediate treatment usually. This is really key for you in looking at whether or not it's a single or multiple primaries. Okay. These are codes for histologies where it would be the same primary. And these are more specific. Let's look up 9676. So instead of myeloproliferative, let's look up 9676. 9876. That is my vision again. 9676 will be a lymphoma, if it exists. Atypical chronic myeloid leukemia, BCR-ABL1 negative. So that's very specific, and it's also very rare. So if you have myeloproliferative disease or disorder and this, This is when it's declared itself, when they've done enough testing to know exactly what type of myeloproliferative disease it is. Okay? Does that make sense? There's kind of a hierarchy of making that diagnosis. Frequently, and this is something that I hadn't mentioned yet, the myeloid neoplasms can be diagnosed, treated, followed, and never go to the hospital ever. Or you can get the biopsy and it says something NOS, and then they go to the doctor's office and get the specific test, so you never find out what the specific disease is. So you would have missed the case completely that way. So a lot of times the final diagnosis resides in the hematologist's office or the medical oncologist's office. So it's important to follow up with those, especially for like the polycythemia veras, the things that used to be considered pre-malignant. A lot of times those don't even come into the hospital at all. Most of the chronics you don't see in the hospital unless they're there for a hip replacement or something, another cancer or something like that, and you just happen to find them. What else have we got in here? Corresponding ICD-9 codes and corresponding ICD-10 codes. So, and then that's what's in here. So there's a ton of stuff in this database. I mean, it's an incredible, incredible resource. And it has every kind of lymphoma and leukemia that is currently in our definitions. So it's a tremendous asset for us right now. So this is in case we didn't have the internet in here. How to access the database in the manual, in case you forget by the time you walk out the door, like me. Doorways are really tough. Doorways erase my memory. What did I come to the kitchen for? Okay. So this tells you exactly how to find it, what to do, click here, click there. And if you do the desktop version, make sure you sign up for the updates notification. Okay? If you are downloading the database to your desktop, the sign up for notification is below the download. So people miss it a lot of times. And that's why so many people are in the wrong version. So make sure you sign up for those updates. We just went through this, Information for Cancer Registrars, Hematopoietic Project, and see they've already reorganized this. What we just looked at online had these in the reverse order. So, there are changes happening all the time. But this was to show you that the background presentations are still available there. And then we're looking at the different components, how to do an advanced search or a simple search. So we've already done a lot of this stuff. And this is all the information that's in the database. One thing we didn't do that we should do, we didn't look at the manual. So I just clicked on that link, and here is the coding manual. It's only about 100 pages. Only. In a world where manuals tend to proliferate. This is the 2012 version. So here we have lots of different names. Oh, there's my name. And this tells you what the revisions are, but where I want to get to is the table of contents. Oops, a little too far. So here in the table of contents, we have case reportability instructions, what's reportable and what's not. It has it in the database, but these are the instructions. The multiple primary rules, the primary site and histology coding rules. So this tells you if you have a lot of terms, how to pick the right one. Okay, that's what these rules are for. And they're separated, the primary site and histology coding rules tell you also what primary site you can code them to, as well as the histology. And they're divided into modules. The modules are grouped into similar types of hematopoietic or lymphoid neoplasms. So if you're just looking at the plasma cell tumors, there's a module for the plasma cell tumors. Right here. Extraosseous plasmacytoma, solitary plasmacytoma of the bone, plasma cell myeloma, which used to be called multiple myeloma, but now the preferred term is plasma cell myeloma, and plasma cell leukemia, which is obsolete, the terminology. So by looking in the database where it says go to module 7 rule pH 27 or something like that. That's going to help you navigate through all of this. Because if you just look at it as a big group, it looked like too much. So use the database to go back to the manual. The manual also has a glossary, very nice glossary, that is also going to be enhanced in 2014. The glossary has lots of great terms. Acute neoplasm, anemia, apheresis, B cells, B and T cell combined, blah, blah, blah. So what's a Bence-Jones protein? So you're not alone in the world. You have all this information in one location as a resource, okay? So that's how we want to use this. And the appendices, you will probably never read Appendix A because everything in it is obsolete. But they insisted that April Fritz write it. So we had some documentation about what was and what is. Okay? So that's what this appendix is all about. I've read it a couple of times. Didn't really make sense to me, but Appendix B is an appendix that we will be talking about. It is the actual WHO classification of these neoplasms. And it's nice because the WHO classification in 2008, when it was released, separated things into myeloid and lymphoid. And there are 6 groups of myeloid and 6 groups of lymphoids. So that makes that fairly easy. And we'll talk about the details of those a little bit later. Appendix C is well, actually, let's look at a couple of these. Myelodysplastic syndromes. How about that? Those used to not be reportable until 2004. And that's when we started asking them to be reportable, because that's when it became, a couple of years before that, recognized that these myelodysplastic syndromes, all these myelodysplasias, were actually already systemic disease. So here's the table B4 for myelodysplastic syndromes. All of these are types of myelodysplastic syndromes. So what you were talking about, you had a myeloproliferative. So there's another group for myelodysplastic / myeloproliferative. Right there. So these tables can help. I like these tables a lot. Other people, they're too confusing for them. But it groups these. The acute myeloid leukemias is a large group. Okay. And here's where that myeloid, that chloroma is, myeloid sarcoma. And then we go into, there are also diseases that are related to certain types of other conditions, like Castleman disease or Down syndrome or things like that, where these patients tend to get certain types of myeloid neoplasms or lymphoid neoplasms. And there are other types of lymphoid diseases, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that are actually directly or indirectly caused by viruses. And we'll talk a lot about that. They're important. So when we get out of the leukemias, we start looking at the lymphoids. First, we have precursor lymphoids, and this is a group that's leukemia / lymphoma. So it's a lymphoma that's behaving like a leukemia, basically. The largest group is the mature B cell neoplasms. It goes on and on. Mature T cell and natural killer cells. And then Hodgkin lymphoma is a small group, basically classical Hodgkin lymphoma, and then some other terms. These, I told you, histiocytic and dendritic will probably eventually get up in the B group, and then the post-transplants. So those are the groups. And actually, that's all the conditions right there. So even though it sounds like, all these words to describe, just, 100 conditions, it seems like overkill, but it's a lot's been done about that. So, okay. And Appendix C can be really helpful, especially for newbies. This is a cross-reference table of lymph nodes, lymph node chains, ICDO site codes, and the differences between the ICDO3 term for the chain or node and the AJCC term. So, and I think it's in alphabetical and numeric order. Most of them are. But if you see a lymph node chain, and you can use this for your solid tumors too, this lymph node reference. So I like to suggest to people that they print out just these pages and keep them at a handy reference, because if they're looking for colon cancers and they want to know, is this lymph node chain part of the colon that I'm looking at the resection, this can be very, very helpful for that. Okay. And there are lots of names. There are multiple names sometimes for the same lymph node chains too. Most of them are named by where they are in the body, like mesenteric lymph nodes are in the mesentery. But the mesentery is in lots of places. So mesenteric lymph nodes is really an NOS term. You really want to know what part of the mesentery those are in, or different things like that. So you can use these for lots of different purposes. And I think there's one more appendix, maybe two. New histology terms. It's not so important to you guys because they're all new to you. And obsolete histologies, which now that you know not to use the codes, that's all you need to know. Don't use the codes. Pretty soon there will be edits. There aren't edits yet. So if you use obsolete codes, they will be time sensitive. So they'll look at the data diagnosis and the code that you use, and you'll in another year, I think, those edits will be in place, and you won't be able to use those codes. So that's what's in the manual. So there's a complement to the manual and the database, and they are meant to be used together. So here's the rules in the manual, what's in the PDF and what's in the database. And again, do not use ICD-03 to code any histology 9590 or higher. Okay? Now, when I use my ICD-03, I always use the numerical listings, not the alphabetical listings. So I just go to the numeric and cross out everything 9590 and higher. It's harder to do in the alphabetical section because you have to go line by line. So just try and remember that. For some people, it can be difficult to remember because people want to do a quick reference, and popping open the database every time to do it is kind of a nuisance, but it's the only way you're going to get the right answer every time. So here is a comparison of what's in the manual and what's in the database. And they're different. And that's why they complement one another. Okay? So this is a good slide to know to help you navigate to the right resource, the right part of this resource that you need. We already did this. We already did this. If we didn't have internet, we would be talking through all this stuff again. Diagnostic methods, treatment, transformations, and then we already did our searching. A bone marrow or a blood smear usually provides that provisional diagnosis, and later you get specific genetic testing or other type of molecular testing that's done. Let's see. We've already done all this, so, and we're going to use that more. Do remember when you're abstracting your cases to put to document the text of these as best you can, especially if it's a really specific diagnosis, because that's the confirmation that the central registry will be looking for, or your manager or somebody like that if they're doing QC for you. And this is more examples. We've already talked about all this stuff. So in this practice case, we have an MRI of the head and neck that shows multiple masses suspicious for neoplasm, possibly plasmacytomas. And head and neck is kind of a weird place for plasmacytomas, but they did a biopsy of the pharynx and it showed plasmacytoma. They did a FISH. Y'all know what FISH is? Okay. FISH is one of the types of specialty testing that we can use that code 3 for if it's positive. And it showed Ig clonal rearrangements with a diagnosis of plasmacytoma. As you mature in your career, you will understand that the plasma cell tumors, the plasma cell dyscrasias, plasmacytoma, and multiple myeloma, or plasma cell myeloma, usually they have what's called a clonal spike. So they'll be either IgA or IgG. They'll have a spike in a certain type of tissue, the test that they do on the tissue. And they may do this test on urine. They may do it on bone marrow. They may do it on tissue that they do a biopsy from just a plasmacytoma site. Now, why would they need to do that in so many different ways? The reason is sometimes the plasmacytomas proliferate so greatly that the plasma cells clog the bone marrow. And when they put that needle into the bone marrow and they try and suck out the marrow, they get what's called a dry tap. It's so stuffed in there, it's so clogged with plasma cells, they can't get anything out. So they can't make a diagnosis. But these conditions also have special characteristics where the IgG, IgA, whatever the clone might be, also will show up in the urine. So they may do what's called a urine electrophoresis, or they may do a blood or serum electrophoresis that shows this clonal spike. So there are different ways to do testing for that clonal proliferation. Okay? So what we're going to do here is figure out what the primary site in the histology is by using the database. Going back again, let's look at plasmacytoma. Let's see if I still have it open. Okay, y'all with me? Okay, for plasmacytoma, we have extraosseous plasmacytoma and solitary plasmacytoma of the bone. And extraosseous, what does that mean? It's not in the bone. It's outside the bone. Okay. Now, when we looked at this first example, we're looking at a plasmacytoma of the pharynx. So that's extraosseous plasmacytoma. So what would the primary site be? Pharynx. And the histology would be extraosseous plasmacytoma. Now let me toggle back again to the database and see we have plasmacytoma extraosseous, so we know the histology code. The primary site says see abstractor notes on Module 2. Oh, and Module 2. Module 2, Rule PH3. So that's when we have to open the manual, go to Module 2. Oops, too far. And what was the pH? pH 3. And here is what tells you code the primary site to the site of origin, which was the biopsy of the pharynx, right? So this tells you to code it to pharynx. And then it tells you code it to extramedullary or extraosseous plasmacytoma. Extramedullary, extraosseous, same meaning. Okay? So that's how the two work together. And I'm sorry our folks in the back who were wondering how they work together and why you need both aren't here. So we may go through this again when we come back. Okay? But that's how you work through using the manual and using the database. Okay? Does that make a little more sense now? You know what I'd like to do? Because we have some people missing, I'd like to go through this again when we come back from break. Okay, let's just start right here.